This is the first tutorial for animation using 3D Studio Max with Redshift. There are a few things that we need to be able to cover: configure time, playback rate, and the tools. Notice here you have what's called the slider, which has the time scale as depicted in frames. Where the mouse is right now is where you need to work, and what you want to do first is configure time. We're going to stay with the NTSC, which is 30 frames per second. Playback is real time, but we want to increase the animation from 100 frames to 300 frames. You will always start time at 1, and rule of thumb, never animate when you're on frame 0. Frame 0 should be your model at its most perfect state. All right, good. Double check. Okay. And now you'll notice that the slider has increased in number from 1 to 300. So at 30 frames per second, 300 frames, that's 10 seconds. The purpose here is we're going to make a teapot and move this teapot around the alto display of the vases. So first, make your teapot, scale it appropriately. Always save after you've done something you're satisfied with. So the mouse is tracing the path for the teapot. So first we want to probably adjust the position of the teapot as we begin so that it's facing the back wall. And I'm going to do two things here. I'm going to make a key and then also turn on the auto key. So first there's a key, that is the first frame. Now auto key is on. The process here is that I will advance to a specific frame. You can type it in or move the slider, and then you use the simple transform tools to move your teapot. So frame first, transform tools second. And then you'll notice if you look at the keyframe, or if you look at the slider, you can see a red, green, and blue marker on the timeline. That means that a key for a specific type of transformation has happened at that location. So you're going to continue to do this. And if you notice that I'm not just moving, but I'm also moving and rotating. Now, there are undesirable effects which have to do with interpolation, which we spoke about in the lecture. Now, and you'll see an example of that as we move ahead. Notice that I'm using the tool in the graphics window. You can use transform type in. That's using a right mouse click on any of the move, rotate, or scale tools. And therefore you can get a precise rotation or a movement to a precise location. So first I set the frame, then I use the transform tool to change the location or the rotation of the teapot. So frame. Now I will move the teapot, and you notice that there will be a tick mark in the timeline, which is its keyframe. And you'll notice once we launch the curves, which is a different way of looking at our timeline, that there is two parallel sets, one type of key for each type of transformation. Rotate it so it faces the far wall. Turn off the auto key. Notice now the red is missing from the timeline. And if you use what the term is called scrub, we can now pull the timeline, and we notice that our teapot is moving and it is rotating. You can certainly refine this movement, and we'll give you a few examples on how to do that. Alright, so if you use the playback controls there on the lower right hand portion, you notice now that you can hit the play button and we can watch our teapot as it rotates around the podium for the alto vase. So after you check this, you're pleased with the motion of the object, then you can save the file and then begin to prepare for rendering it out as a sequence of images. Alright, so you need to launch the render setup. Check to make sure you have the right viewport that's set to render. You want to render a range here, and remember, not 0 to 300, but 1 to 300 is our range of files, the range of frames that we're going to render. This doesn't have to be 1 to be 300, it could be any ones that you set to choose. Make sure that you're saving the files now, and we're going to save out a sequence of bitmap or images, which we will then conflate later. Give it a unique name, JPEG or BMP. Notice I've got a few left over in my render output folder. Alright. Double check. I'm going to pick a small size at the moment because we don't need to render it full size, and then I hit the render tool and you'll see here that we begin to render the scene. And it will repeat this for all 300 frames. Alright, in the previous step you notice that the teapot began to rotate prematurely as it was circumnavigating the podium or the display podium. So maybe I didn't quite get the rotation correct. So I'm going to show you a couple of ways where I'm going to add a rotation key earlier, or two keys, one so that it stays moving straight ahead and only begins to turn as it gets close to the corner. And so I do that by, at each corner, I put a rotation key 5 frames before and 5 frames after, so that I can limit the movement of the teapot within that zone. So you can see examples of this if you look at the timeline, where I then add a key where the teapot is in its straight position, and then begin to rotate it, then go to 5 frames after the corner key to make sure that the teapot stays facing the proper direction. So now here, notice now see how it's starting to rotate beforehand? Not desirable. We don't want the rotation to happen until it gets to the corner. Alright, so I was unsuccessful in that instance, but there's another way in which we could begin to make alterations, and that's by launching the curve. If you look at the curve here, you can see that there is a position change for our teapot as well as the rotation, and it's the rotation curve that we want to begin to edit. And you can see how the rotation's happening over a large number of frames. So what we're going to do is reduce the distance or the number of frames between the rotation beginning and the rotation end, so it'll move rather quickly. So after changing the curve, I get to the corner, now the teapot rotates, and now it moves ahead. So you're going to be able to edit or finesse or correct the movement of your objects by using the curve editor. Alright, and you can even add or delete keys in the curve editor, so you can make changes to your objects in a variety of locales. So let's check this once again. Okay, very good. Alright, so now we're interested in being able to render this short animation on the render farm. So what we're going to do is just go through a couple of steps to check. So if you use the reference and then asset tracking, you can check to see that I have saved my file locally, which means that it's not on the network drive, and I need to edit each one of the paths to make sure that I can then send the file to render on the farm. So asset tracking is one way to double check whether or not you have referenced local data or local files, or that you're saving the render output to the local disk. This is something you want to make sure that you, well, if there's a mistake, this is probably the first one that you're going to make. There's a couple of ways to do it. Most of the time I will enter in the information manually for the file itself. And so to get to asset tracking, you go to the file menu, and you go to reference, and you find asset tracker. So this is one of the better troubleshooting tools for you. And I've typed in the correct path to save the file. I've typed in the correct path for all the images for the materials that we're using, making sure that we go to the network drive and see asset images, and then making sure that it reads the file using the ArchData address.